And it is 7 o'clock, so we're going to get started because it's a little bit tight of a schedule this evening. So I want to say good evening to all who are here and to our panelists, and welcome to a People for Effective Government online event. We're glad to have you with us. My name is Ginny Darrell, and Eric Coltrane, another PEG board member, is co-moderating this evening. As you may know, PEG is a nonprofit Spokane-based nonpartisan coalition. Our mission is to support bipartisan approaches to governing, which are fiscally responsible, ensure an adequate social safety net, and promote a civil society. We've been holding in-person forums and online events for over 3 years now. For those who are new to our organization and events, we look forward to having you with us in the future. We're committed to changing the current political climate in which our two major parties have become increasingly polarized. We're working to encourage sincere and civil debate about the challenges that our nation faces and about effective solutions to those challenges by providing speakers with information and perspectives on a variety of relevant topics. We are a small grassroots organization working with very shallow pockets. If you're finding these events helpful if you're finding these events helpful as you think about issues in government at the local, state, or federal level, please consider joining as a member or making a donation to PEG. We're a 501c3 nonprofit relying on membership dues and donations to cover our costs. If you're interested in learning more about PEG and possibly becoming a member, please visit our website at www.pegnow.org. PEG Now is all one word. We've added an electronic payment feature on our website so you can join or donate by clicking on the Get Involved tab. As a reminder to our audience, the views presented by our guest speakers, whether in this discussion or in-person forums, are their own. As a 501c3 nonprofit, PEG neither participates in political campaigns or I'm tongue-tied this evening, as you can see. We neither participate in political campaigns on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office, nor do we engage in political activity of any kind. Our topic tonight is law enforcement and racial bias. This forum will explain the origins of bias, how the brain processes information, how to recognize implicit bias, and how to safeguard against biased decision-making. Attendees will learn that if you have a brain, you have bias, and will gain insight into how to optimize public safety performance in ways that promote equity. Our speakers have a unique combination of experience and depth of research in policing issues, including cross-cultural policing, police fatigue, the impacts of stress on policing, the impacts of bias on police decision-making, counter-bias training, the dynamics of performance in policing tasks, such as citizen encounters, crisis intervention, counter-bias training, the dynamics of performance in policing tasks, I did mess this up, citizen encounters, crisis intervention, and deadly force encounters. The speakers are nationally and internationally recognized in these areas and are personally experienced in policing. Eric, would you like to introduce our speakers?
I'd love to. Here again is Dr. Lois James, the Assistant Dean of Research in the Washington State University College of Nursing, where she focuses on bias, stress, sleep, and performance in high-stress populations, such as police officers, military personnel, nurses, and top-tier athletes. She is one of a handful of research advisors for the International Association of Chiefs of Police and is internationally recognized as a leading expert in her field. Dr. James' simulation-based research on the impact of bias on police decision-making has significantly advanced what is known about how suspect race and ethnicity, as well as other factors, influences police officers during critical encounters with the public. She's the founding director of Counter Bias Training Simulation, a novel and innovative simulation-based implicit bias training program that has been featured in National Geographic and the recent feature-length documentary Bias. Dr. Stephen James is an assistant professor in the College of Nursing at Washington State University Health Sciences, Spokane. His research focus includes the interaction between physical stressors, such as sleep-related fatigue, law, policy, training, and practice relating to operational performance for military and law enforcement personnel. He strives to better understand the dynamics of performance in a wide variety of military and policing tasks, driving citizen encounters, crisis intervention, and deadly force encounters. Their simulation technology has been used to evaluate training and performance of military and law enforcement personnel. This research has led to more effective and more cost-effective training and greater public safety. If you joined us last August for their presentation, you learned about the local, state, and federal agencies that have benefited from their research. It was a great forum, and if you want to look that up, it is on our website. Our audience is welcome to submit questions at any time. Our speakers will answer as many questions as possible before we end the forum around 8:15. It is our policy to ask the audience to be brief, keeping your questions to only 2 to 3 sentences long. You can ask several questions, but please submit only one question at a time. Please submit your questions via the Q&A feature. This event is being recorded and will be posted on our website, www.pegnow.org, within a week or so. Lois and Steve, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So we are going to bounce back and forth a little bit as we present and try not to interrupt each other too much, although we can't really promise too much. But I think one of the important things for this evening is we're going to present a lot of science. We're going to talk quite a bit, of course, about implicit bias. And we want to do so in as non-judgmental and as inclusive a way as possible. So just like Peg tries not to get too engaged in polarization, so do we. We try and let the data and the science speak for itself, and we try and be as objective and as rational as possible. So I hope that that comes across.
Virginia or Eric, could you give us permission to share our screen, please? I think you might need to make us a co-host.
We have some slides that we'd like to share, and also some video clips that we have embedded within the slides, because there's only so much of us talking people can take.
Yeah, Mark, Kenny, are you there and able to do that? I mean, I'm not sure. Host disabled participant screen share.
Yeah, just a minute. Sorry about that. I'll get that fixed here.
No worries. And just kind of to clarify, in the intro, it said that we had personal experience policing. That is when we had Brian on our team. Brian was a former police chief and gang sergeant in LA back in the 70s. And I have come close to policing by working plainclothes military in Belfast for a number of years doing counterterrorism work, but never actually been a sworn police officer, just working in the counterterrorism field.
Thanks for correcting that.
Yeah, no worries. Do I have the go now? Nope, not yet.
That's okay.
Sorry, it's going to take me just a second.
No worries.
No worries. No worries at all.
And just to reiterate, our opening slide has a bunch of logos across the bottom, predominantly federal agencies, Department of Defense, Department of Justice, CDC. They are who fund our research, but we are by no means speaking for them or on behalf of them, and our opinions should not be attributed to any of those federal or state organizations that are shown on our opening slide. We just like to acknowledge the investment that the taxpayer through these organizations have invested in our research.
Okay, you should be good to go.
Great, thank you.
Super.
Thank you, Mark.
Go.
Super. You can see our screen okay?
Yes.
All right. Okay. So, I mean, for anybody who's joined us this evening, you know, it's no surprise, I'm sure, that race relations with law enforcement are particularly strained. We have here on this slide since 2014, which of course was the events of Ferguson. But, you know, since 2020, perhaps even more so. And one thing that's important to note is that doesn't mean that these issues suddenly arose in 2014 or they suddenly arose in 2020. They certainly didn't. And, you know, race relations with policing have been strained since the inception of policing in this country. So, you know, we're certainly not trying to imply that this is a new problem. Arguably, it's a more visible problem now. And also, I think that the public is becoming less and less accepting of what used to be kind of just the way things were, which is a good thing.
And I you know, personally believe that it's a mixture of, we see it more, there's more technology, there's more cameras, there's cell phone cameras, there's body cameras, and our population is better informed of their rights and responsibilities as citizens. So I think it's a factor of a better educated population and more access to technology and media and the distribution. And we don't have the traditional publications or broadcast companies being the gatekeepers of information anymore. With the advent of social media, an individual with a cell phone can reach millions of people very, very quickly.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you know, there are lots of things that are up for debate. One thing that is not up for debate is there are racial disparities in police use of force. That is an irrefutable fact that is extremely soundly backed by science at this point. The extent to which implicit bias is responsible is still very much in question and is a large focus of our research. But before we really get into that, we want to talk about what implicit bias is. So just a little bit more on the background of within policing. Like I said, individual status characteristics do influence their treatment by police, but by society in general. We see that these disparities exist not just in policing. Of course, they exist in healthcare, housing, education, and lots of other services. And it's not exclusive to racial bias, right? You know, we see a lot of evidence of gender bias, for example, in tech, in sports, and in various other fields as well.
And if there's people in the audience or people in society that still don't see it, there has to be a level of willful ignorance now, because it is so prevalent, and you just have to, you know, pick up a newspaper, read a stream. And when I was giving a presentation on this to healthcare providers a few weeks ago, it was just that morning that a woman was denied taking money out of a Black woman was denied taking money out of her own bank, even though the teller confirmed that the funds were available. But the teller felt uncomfortable giving her the $1,000 or so that she was requesting of her own money. And you know, it's hard to justify that. You know, I've been into banks and taken out significantly more money than that, where they've never met me before, they've never asked me a second question. And, you know, one or two instances you can maybe put it down to individual circumstances, but when it is time and time and time again in society that we see that people of color are treated differently without any explanation other than their, you know, the individual characteristics that make up them.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to intersperse our pontificating with some videos, and these videos are all taken from the documentary film Bias. The link there is www.biasfilm.com. Lois and I and our research is featured in this documentary, and it is available on Amazon or iTunes or whatever. And if this is a topic that you are interested in, I would urge you to watch it, to rent it.
We have no financial stake.
We have no financial stake in it. We do have permission from the director and the production company to use it for educational purposes within reason. So we do have permission to use these video clips.
I heard this once, maybe you did too. A father and his son are in a car crash. The father dies. The son is rushed to the hospital. In the hospital, the surgeon looks at the boy and says, "I can't operate on this child. He's my son." Who is the surgeon? You might have gotten the answer right away, or maybe like me, you were stumped. It's just a riddle, but it hit me. If I had such a hard time imagining that the surgeon could be a woman, what other hidden biases do I have? How does bias shape our lives?
So I do hope there was audio involved in that, just because the other videos will not work as well without. Can I just get a thumbs up from someone that you actually heard the audio on that video?
Yes, I heard it.
Thank you.
So interestingly enough, Lois and I just completed a fatigue study with nurses, and in that study, we brought real nurses in straight from the hospital, and as part of the study, we actually recorded what they said and what they looked at. So I have in my lab eye tracking glasses, and these are, you wear them, there's a camera right here, and not only does it sort of capture your field of view, but it actually can identify your exact focal point. But during these simulations, they have to pick up the phone and call a doctor. And the person who answers the phone is a woman playing the doctor. And even though they've spoken to the woman, and even in a few instances after the nurse was corrected, they still refer to the doctor as "he said this," even though they've just spoken to a woman who's simulating being the doctor. And when the simulation tech says, no, Dr. X is a woman, they'll go, oh, okay. They'll turn back to the simulation patient and say, "he said," and it just, just those biases and these
So
gender
ingrained.
roles are so ingrained.
So for people who aren't actually kind of familiar with implicit bias or what it means, it can be helpful to distinguish it from explicit bias. And explicit bias is a bias that you would claim, you would kind of stand up and own it. So for example, if you were to say, "I believe that all cops are corrupt and brutal," that is an explicit bias. Or if you were to think, "I believe that anybody who's homeless, for example, is lazy and unmotivated or somehow responsible for their situation," that is an explicit bias. Implicit bias, on the other hand, is unconscious or semi-conscious. And if you are aware of it, you certainly wouldn't claim it, because of social desirability or that's just not who you want to be. So examples are, associating mental illness with personal weakness, women with subservience, Black men with violence, homosexuality with predatory behavior, etc. There are countless different types of very, very pervasive implicit biases, and I'll talk about how those become so ingrained here in a bit. But this just kind of expands on that a little bit. You can see in terms of explicit bias, you're aware of it, typically conveyed directly, it's conscious, it's voluntary, it's planned. So a kind of a healthcare example would be, I like fit patients more than obese patients. Implicit bias, on the other hand, is unaware, often conveyed indirectly. So you hear a lot about kind of microaggressions where somebody says something that, maybe they don't intend to be hurtful or harmful or mean, but nonetheless it is. It's kind of conveyed indirectly in that sense. It can work subconsciously, it can be involuntarily activated, spontaneous. So an example would be, in this case, sitting farther away from an obese person than a skinny person. Another very clear example would be crossing the street when a black man is approaching you, for example. So those, you mightn't even be aware of doing it, but if you do, you need to really think about, why that might be.
And it can be very subtle, like if an African American or black man gets in an elevator with you, you grab your purse with both hands. You may not be doing it consciously, but it is still conveyed. So this is Mazarine. She is from Harvard and she's a rock star.
The origins of implicit bias are really interesting because they come from so many different places. We evolved over millions of years to have the kind of brains that we have today. Those brains were set up to allow our ancestors to survive in an old world, a world where they lived with groups of people just like them. Somebody who lived on the other side of the mountain was typically an enemy. We have inherited a part of those people, to be suspicious of people who are different from us, because that's what made our ancestors survive. Which is why we shouldn't beat ourselves up for the kind of brains we have. We should just ask ourselves the following question: is that useful in the modern world? If I look at you and I think, yeah, you and I are one, then I will use the brain resources that I would have used to think for myself what's good for me, and I'm going to give those to you. And of course, from that come a variety of differences in decisions. And it's by giving a leg up to the ones who come from my university or my neighborhood or my kind of people in some way. That's the way in which I continually keep the playing field uneven. And I can feel good about it at the end of the day. I helped somebody. How do our actions, however well intended, reflect our biases? By favoring people in our group? Who are we excluding? In the business world, risk can yield the greatest reward. Yet investors are more likely to take a chance on someone who looks and acts just like them. So what happens when someone with a good idea doesn't fit the pattern? The origin.
So some of these we've already kind of touched upon, but some very, very pervasive social stereotypes associating race and threat is a big one, and obviously a kind of a main point of this forum this evening. Gender and dominance, of course, is another. Class and dominance, and mental illness and weakness. And this last one we do see quite a bit in policing as well. Sexual orientation and dysfunction, age and societal use, addiction and moral weakness. And I'm sure that there are plenty of others that people could think of as well.
And it's interesting with our work, and we're going to sort of touch on this in the second half of the presentation, but with our work with police officers in training them through our service center counter-bias training simulation, a lot of the other biases come to the fore, and sometimes they're quite explicit about them, whereas they would never say out loud, especially not to people from outside, well, I don't like black men, whatever. They feel very comfortable in saying, well, I don't like homeless people, or I don't like people with mental illness. Some of the biases that we see quite often they're quite explicit about. So, one of the interesting things about police and the role of policing in society is that at their core, police are designed to maintain the status quo. They were initiated and conceptualized by those in the in-group, those who have
Empower.
Those who are in power. And when we think about bias, any of these sort of layers where you're further from the in-group make you a target for both explicit and implicit bias, especially in America. If you're white, you're in the in-group. Male, higher SES. Straight, if you identify as your gender you were born in. If you're an English speaker, if you're younger, able-bodied, have an average BMI, and this goes both ways. People who are too skinny can get have bias against them, targeted, versus those who are also overweight and obese. And in some instances, tall. You know, it's favorable for men to be tall, but it can be it can be looked down upon if you're a woman to be tall. So kind of understanding this is kind of the pyramid of the status quo, and anyone who does not fall within these groups is at greater risk of being a victim of either explicit or implicit bias.
So in the way that biases are formed, you know, I mean, in some ways biases can be very rational, in some ways, of course, they can be very irrational. So bias is often based on prior experience, and you'll have to excuse us using a fair number of healthcare examples, but it is an area that we work in as well. And I also find that sometimes it's useful. I don't know if we have police officers in the forum this evening, but sometimes it's useful to look at it from a slightly different lens and remove the kind of the really personal part of it.
And it's important for us to remember that every occupation, every person is susceptible to bias, and we all have them. I mean, we absolutely all have them. And just because you're not a police officer, or just because you are a police officer, doesn't mean that you are biased because of your occupation. You're biased because you're human, and your experience and your exposure from your occupation
certainly can
certainly enhance or diminish that if it's targeted correctly.
So an example of how a bias kind of can come about from prior experience, if a nurse has a negative experience with a particular type of patient, for example, they're more likely to then be suspicious and wary of other patients that resemble the patient that they had the bad experience with. And unfortunately, that is a rational response. It's not a fair response, because the incoming patient is not responsible for what happened to the nurse, and yet you can easily see how that could happen and how that does happen. The most dangerous demographic for policing by a long way is men. Just when you simply look at the statistics, men are far more likely to assault police officers, to kill police officers, and so on and so forth. And yet officers, by and large, don't approach every man with the belief that that man might be dangerous. So there are some kind of really interesting and peculiar ways that biases work, and some ways that they're rational and some ways that they're not. And a big part of that, just like Mazarine was saying, is this in and out grouping. So it's people who are like us versus people who are not. We tend to really, really favor the in-group and not so much the out-group. So, you know, does that mean that an officer of color might not hold some biases, him or herself? No, that doesn't necessarily mean that. But the in-grouping and out-grouping certainly does count for quite a lot at a very basic and core evolutionary level.
And this may have played a role in January 6th and the response to the protests. If law enforcement identified more with the legitimate protest that was going on before it devolved into what it devolved into, that may have been why they seem to have been caught off guard by the extremity of it.
So in terms of how bias is so dangerous, and I'm sure, like I said, everybody who's on the call this evening is probably quite aware of how bias is dangerous. But it's not just the act, it's not just a racist act that's the problem, right? Unfortunately, it goes a lot deeper than that. And part of it is this kind of culture of silence and turning a blind eye, because that is collusion with bias. And whether that's within a police department, whether that's kind of colleagues and peers, or whether it's broader society at large, it's kind of, not dissimilar to the kids on the playground that don't stand up to a bully, that don't say anything. And again, you can sometimes understand why that might be the case, because you don't want to be targeted yourself. You don't, conflict avoidant, you might just not want to put yourself in that situation. But unfortunately, until people are willing to put themselves in that situation, nothing's really going to change, because that silence, that collusion just enables this status quo. And it just means that, you know, I mean, yes, there'll be public outroar for a particular outcry for a particular amount of time, but everybody's kind of, well, not everybody, but a lot of people are keen for things just to get back to normal and for people to stop talking about it. And that's, again, doesn't necessarily mean that all of those people are racist. It just means that they are unwilling to stand up and really get involved in trying to dismantle some of these structural issues.
And not to put, you know, not to put too much emphasis on this, but, you know, we look back through history and we wonder, how did the National Socialist Party in Germany in the 30s gain so much power, and how did the Nazis take over Germany and then try and take over the rest of Europe and beyond? Why didn't someone say something? You know, where was that silent majority in those early days? So yes, you know, peaceful protest can be disruptive, but having a society that recognizes and values the freedom of speech and the right to assemble and the right to protest peacefully is one of those checks and balances that the United States has to guard against, you know, the rise of fascism and so on. So, you know, we shouldn't not learn those lessons from the past.
One last thing on that previous slide that I do think is important just to touch on, and it's talked about quite a lot in the documentary, is there's a difference between intentions and impact. And I always want, you know, if there's one thing that I want people to come away from a forum like this or presentations that we give, it is this: being well-intended, having good intentions is not enough. You can intend not to cause harm, but if your actions actually do cause harm, you're accountable for that as well. You're responsible for that as well. So I think we need to move beyond this. And I get it, I understand it, you know, I mean, because it feels uncomfortable and you feel like, well, that's not fair. I'm being blamed for something that I didn't mean. I didn't mean for that to be taken in that way. But it, you know, especially in today's society, we do need to be very mindful of the impact that we have. And that's just, I mean, it's personal growth, it's societal growth, and it's a really, really important piece of starting to turn this tide and to dismantle some of these systemic and structural issues. So in terms of how bias is learned, and we've touched on this a little bit already, but there are a couple of, you know, examples here that I want to briefly touch on. It can be subtle and unintentional societal conditioning. So an example of that is how different types of offenders are depicted in the news. And again, I'm certainly not going to get political, so I'm not implying, you know, I know of course there are differences between different news stations, but overall, in general, I think it was a couple of years ago, and it was not Brock Turner here, but it was, there were two men who both committed a fairly similar crime at about the same time. One was a black man, one was a white man. They were both being depicted, you know, spoken about in the media at about the same time. And this news piece came out, this kind of opinion piece that was like, are people noticing the difference in how these two men are being portrayed? And the offenses were extremely similar, but the white man typically was shown with family photos, was referred to as a, you know, devoted husband, loving father, was always referred to by name, and was really humanized, right? The black man, the black offender, was typically just his mugshot was shown. He was referred to as the suspect, the offender, the perp. He was typically not, you know, he also had a wife and children. They weren't mentioned, and you know, once it was pointed out, it was extremely obvious. The big concern and the big fear is if that's not pointed out to people, they might not even realize it. They might not even recognize it. And that is one of the ways that implicit bias is learned and perpetuated. Because if you're not aware of what biases might be forming, you've got very little hope of doing anything about it. Another way that's more systematic and institutional is the war on drugs of the late 80s, early 90s. And, you know, for whatever your stance and whatever your take on whether it was a racially biased, with racially biased intention, it most definitely had racial impact, right? So again, just like we as individuals need to be accountable, not just for our intentions, but for our impact, policies such as this, if it becomes clear after a certain point that the policy is discriminating against a group of people, then that just has to be changed. Because, you know, even if it wasn't intended in that way, and there are kind of legitimate reasons, you know, I mean, there were legitimate reasons for wanting to curtail the drug trade, and of course that's understandable. But when it does become so obvious that it's discriminatory, something needs to happen, because if it doesn't, that is a clear example of systemic racism.
And particularly around the issue of sentencing for drug offenses for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. And the rationale behind it was that the violence associated with the crack cocaine market and business was significantly higher than with the powder business. But again, you know, that rationale honestly pales into comparison to the disproportionate effect or impact it had on Black communities all across America.
Yeah. And then the last one, this is actually a personal example, a personal story that we share. Steve and I are married, and we have
to each other.
We have a now almost 12-year-old daughter, but when she was about 3.5, I had taken her to the gym, and she went to the daycare in the gym while I worked out, and got home, and I was playing with her and playing with Lego friends, like you can see on the screen, which are just like bigger Lego that have actual skin tone. And I passed her one to play with, and she looked at me and she said, "No, Mommy, I don't want to play with that one." And I was like, "Well, why not?" And my, you know, all of the hairs on the back of my neck are standing up, and I know something awful is coming. And she said, "Well, she has dark skin. I don't like her." So my immediate response, my immediate thing was like, take a breath, don't, you know, because I wanted to say that, what a terrible thing to say, but she's 3.5 years old. She didn't pluck this out of the air, right? So I took a breath, kind of calmly spoke with her, and it emerged very quickly, thankfully, that this was something that the woman who was in charge of the daycare at the gym had said to her. They had a very similar interaction where Sarah had picked up a doll, and this white woman had said, "Oh, you don't play with that one. She's not as nice. She has dark skin." So Steve immediately went to deal with the systemic issue here and make sure that that woman did not ever work in that situation again. And I started the process of dismantling the implicit bias that our daughter had just formed based on what was said to her. So the kind of important things here, you know, and again, there's this issue of kind of blame, and I know we always get a little prickly about, you know, the idea that we're being thought of as biased or you know, it feels uncomfortable. This example really does show. I mean, I doubt anybody on this call would blame our daughter in that moment for saying that based on that situation. But unfortunately, she did say it, and it did take a long time for us to dismantle that. And what if I hadn't played Lego Friends with her that day? What if that had just become ingrained in who she was? You know, I mean, these are reasons why it's so important to understand what implicit bias is and to really work on it. A lot of the work that we do, of course, is looking at implicit bias and bias in general within policing. One of the various different ways that we do this, one is by looking at statistics, and each of these have strengths and limitations as measures. Looking at statistics is great because you're actually looking at the data. It's problematic because you have limited control over lots of other variables, not a whole ton of accounting for exposure, but we do, of course, see evidence of disparities there. Because of some of those concerns, we moved then, not we personally, but in general, to controlled experiments where you have a great deal of precision in favor of realism. However, you do have more limited psychological immersion. It's not a real situation. You do also, though, see evidence of disparities. With police more specifically, we do look at incident reports from police citizen encounters. Again, like statistics, limited control over some confounding variables and some limited accounting for exposure. There are also a lot of shoot, don't shoot experiments, which are typically the kind of the button pressing design. So you see the image here. It's not a very clear image, but you would press a button saying shoot if you believed that person was carrying a weapon, or don't shoot if you believe that they weren't. Very precise, limited psychological validity. So what we tend to do in our lab is we use simulation because it kind of combines some of that realism. It's still an artificial environment, but you've got video scenarios. It's more immersive, certainly. However, it is at the downside of being a lot more expensive and more time consuming. And more recently, a number of our studies are using body camera footage. And I do think that that is likely the future of this work, because it gives you the largest ability to control for a number of variables. It is, of course, however, expensive and time consuming and dependent on a department,
Right.
on a department letting you access it.
We received a large grant from the Department of Justice to look at the impact of different forms of implicit bias training on law enforcement behavior. And just with the way grant cycles work, we applied for it months and months and months before it was awarded, and before we would start the data collection with an agency that was willing and excited to be on board with us. Unfortunately, between submitting the grant and being awarded the grant, the chief that was there moved on, as is so often the case. And the new chief was like, yeah, we want to do the training. We just don't want to wait a year to do the baseline, because with this study, we collected body camera footage for a year before we delivered the training, just to see what the behavior right before the training looked like, so we could then compare that to the behavior of the officers on the street afterwards. We went through maybe 50 different agencies before we found one that was willing to partner with us. And we would find that the chief said yes, but the union said no, or the chief and the union said yes, but then the city manager or the city attorney said no. And it was just a nightmare trying to find agencies that would allow us in to do this work. But thankfully, we're working with a large California-based agency on this project, and they've been incredibly supportive of this work.
Implicit bias is sort of an amalgam of many different things that make us the kind of people that we are. And one way to study the roots of bias is to look at the brain directly, which we can do. We did a study in which we introduced people to two individuals, John and David. John and David were both great people. They were described as having done amazingly good things. There was only one difference between them. One happened to be liberal, the other conservative. If I'm the subject in the study, one of these people matches me and the other one does not match me. We now have people like me, the subject, make decisions about John and David. Simple decisions that have nothing to do with politics. You know, in the summer, what do you think he might do? What kind of foods does he like to eat? We discovered that our brains think about these two people in slightly different regions. So in the medial prefrontal cortex, there is a region we call the more dorsal part and the more ventral part. And what we find is that when you think about the one who's like you, you're using that ventral area. When you're thinking about the one who's a little different from you, you're actually using a different part of neural real estate. And this is important because the neurons that we are using to think about the one who happens to be like us are the neurons that we use to think about the most precious person in the universe to us, and that is we ourselves.
So some of the results that we have from our lab looking at these types of things. We do look at implicit bias via brainwaves, EG. And then, of course, we use the implicit association test as well, which is going to be described now.
Look, I know you're not like that, but if it would make you feel better, you should take this internet test my brother-in-law made us all take last Thanksgiving. It's a good test. Said I was racially unbiased, and I love gay people. I didn't see that one coming, but I'm happy.
Roger, show me this test.
There really is a test. It's called the Implicit Association Test, or the IAT. And the first one was created in 1994. It turns out the way we unconsciously link two unrelated ideas in our minds helps reveal the root of implicit bias. Over 17 million people have taken the IAT online, and thousands of scientific studies are based on it.
Look.
So the IAT is a test that we do use quite a lot in the lab, but we like to use it in collaboration or in conjunction with some simulation-based testing as well. And there are good reasons why.
What these tests are measuring are our associations.
Yeah.
What are the associations I have with Black people, or with entrepreneurs, or with women, or what have you?
Yeah.
And those associations that we make, the things that can
Pop in instantly.
are a function of the worlds we live in, right? You live in a world where woman and entrepreneur are absolutely paired, right? That's your life. Others of us live in worlds where those things couldn't be further apart.
When you think of the word entrepreneur, do you think of female or do you think of male? When you think of a Black male, what do you think? Do you think good? Do you think evil? You can't cheat the test.
You can't cheat the tests.
When I gave myself the first version of this race test, I thought I was a totally unprejudiced person. And I do believe that I am unprejudiced, but this test is picking up something that I now regard as different from prejudice or racism, but I'm carrying something with me that is a liability in circumstances in which I want to behave equally to white and Black people, because I've got these automatic associations that are going to pop up and influence my responses and judgments without my even thinking about it.
People often will say, oh, if you show an implicit bias, then you're a racist. We think it's important to reserve the word racist for people who explicitly, consciously say things that we would classify as racism. What the implicit bias test is picking up is sort of the thumbprint of the culture on our brain.
I think people don't like to use the word racism or sexism because it implies an intention behind it. And the reason why bias is easier to hear is that it implies there's a brain functioning happening in the background. And yet the outcome is often the same. If I'm overtly sexist and say I don't want women on my team, or if I'm implicitly biased and I don't value women, and the outcome is that there are no women on my team, the result is the same.
Back in the day, right, racism was quite explicit. There was no need to hide our hostility towards certain groups. Explicit vitriol, right, how we treated, Japanese Americans during World War II. None of that was implicit. That was all explicit.
We were hoping that McCann Erickson could provide, at the minimum, an introduction to your departments to our clients, so we can assess their desire for a store brand.
And I'd be happy to meet you.
Especially Dan Higgins. He loves the redheads.
Back in the days of Mad Men, or in the 50s, or even earlier, there was no need to suggest that we thought of men and women exactly the same in terms of their capacities, abilities, their career trajectories. But now we've embraced a much more egalitarian set of expectations for all of us, that we could really do anything regardless of the social categories we inhabit. Unconscious bias is just one mechanism, one stream that may support the racism or sexism that we're all trying to dismantle.
I think it's great to become aware of implicit bias for sure. The problem is that it feels uncomfortable. So it's easy to go from that awareness to doing nothing, to saying, to just letting it go and moving on with your life.
I recommend not feeling guilt, but feeling responsibility. It's giving us a picture of something that we can't intuit ourselves. And once we have that, then it's up to individuals to decide what they want to do with it, up to institutions. And of course, as a society, we can collectively decide what we want to do with it.
So I'm going to move, quite quickly because I know we're a little pressed for time, but I'm going to move through some of the research and some of the statistics very specific to racial disparities in police-citizen encounters. So there is certainly some evidence of implicit bias within those encounters. For example, Black suspects are more likely to be unarmed when shot. Several kind of seminal studies have found this. Police do tend to use greater force against minorities, even accounting for covariates. Again, some very high-profile studies have found this. Threat perception failure is greater against Black suspects. And this one really does actually speak more to the implicit bias piece. So this is when officers make mistakes. They actually believe that the individual is carrying a weapon and it turns out that they're not. And that tends to happen more with Black individuals than with white individuals. In the experimental designs, officers do tend to be quicker to press shoot when faced with Black suspects than white suspects. And we see some race-based threat perception failure again in the Washington Post data, which was a very large data set collected in 2017. Within our lab, when we use the IAT, we do see some, fairly overwhelming evidence of implicit associations between Black Americans and weapons among our law enforcement participants. On the flip side, there is a lot of science and a lot of evidence out there that does suggest that bias can be managed. So racial disparities do tend to diminish, and in some studies have seen that they've disappeared when criminal activity is controlled for. Officers, although they show bias in reaction times, they don't tend to show bias in errors in the shoot, don't shoot button pressing designs. A different researcher who analyzed the Washington Post data found some discrepancies and some issues there. We have found that suspect race wasn't actually a predictor of police behavior when using an incident report study. And then during a ride-along study, we found that, that suspect race wasn't a significant predictor of police behavior as well. In terms of some of our lab-based results with de-escalation, we found that race and ethnicity didn't predict how officers interacted with citizens, nor did socioeconomic status or how citizens were dressed. However, citizen demeanor was significant. So individuals who were confrontational were more likely to have officers escalate scenarios. And an important point that's not actually on the slide is that it wasn't a significant result, but we did see a little bit of an interaction between demeanor and race. So an officer tended to take confrontational behavior or to read more into confrontational behavior when the individual on screen was Black versus when they were white. So there's a clear problem there. There have been some studies that have shown a potential fear of consequences motivator. And those kind of date back to in the 70s, in some observation of training, also in some interviews. This has been something that's come up quite a bit. A Harvard researcher found that when including an other force comparison, Black suspects were actually less likely to get shot. And again, another study found something quite similar as well. In our lab, and recall that in our lab, we find that officers tend to have strong implicit associations between Black Americans and weapons. And yet when we test them in the simulator, we see kind of a very different pattern starting to emerge where officers actually tend to be a little bit more hesitant to shoot Black suspects than white suspects.
And A and C in this, they're still images from the video. And we just wanted to kind of show how comparable the videos are. They're in the same positions, saying the same things, acting in the same way.
And again, when errors were made, they tended to be, like I said, a little bit more hesitant, a little bit more cautious, a little bit more keen to get it right when the person on screen was Black versus white. And of course, there are lots and lots of potential reasons for that, that we don't necessarily have time to go into in great detail here, but this kind of fear of like, what, you know, how is it going to look? That's certainly a possible explanation. It's important, and you know, one of the reasons that I think the public finds this so difficult to kind of merge and understand these mixed and contradictory results, there are two things that are really important. One is that methodology matters. So how the studies are conducted really do matter. You need to have a denominator to account for exposure. You need to really consider how force is measured. Consider the study sample. You know, officers in one city are not necessarily comparable to officers in a different city. And you really need to think about the limitations with each method that I've already discussed. And then the other one for us researchers that's extremely important is the ideology matters. We need to be unbiased. We need to not selectively highlight our results, and we need to be very mindful of how those results could be picked up. One last thing just on the research front that we find in our lab is that we do find a significant impact of fatigue on bias. So sleep-deprived officers are more implicitly biased against Black Americans, and this leads us to speculate whether fatigue impairs our ability to control or override our biases. We do see it in the simulator as well, that this this inclination to be more hesitant to shoot Black Americans or Black individuals versus white individuals does tend to diminish when an officer is tired.
Some new findings by our recently graduated with her PhD student. So she did some great work looking at oxygen use in the prefrontal cortex, the moral decision-making part of our brain. PTSD symptomology and de-escalation found that officers suffering from the symptoms of PTSD showed less cognitive control and were less willing to de-escalate. And this is significant considering how prevalent PTSD and PTSD symptomology is in our first responder communities as a whole.
So the last thing that we want to talk about before we open it up for questions is what can we do about this kind of specifically within policing? And there are a number of different approaches that all have some promise. One, of course, is implicit bias training. It's becoming increasingly popular in law enforcement departments around the country. Typically, not always, but typically it's classroom based, tends to be kind of an academic presentation taught by people such as us, kind of outside people to the department, a focus on understanding the science of bias and a focus on raising awareness, all of which are important things. Another approach, which almost takes the opposite tact actually, is use of deadly force judgment decision-making training, or kind of any judgment training, which is simulation-based, is more practical application, and instead of actually focusing on how different characteristics might influence an officer, it attempts to strip all of that away and focus exclusively on the objective threat assessment. Emotional intelligence is another approach that's gaining more and more traction within departments. Kind of the key elements there being thinking before acting, finding commonalities, developing empathy, self-regulating, maintaining motivation. It's very easy to get burned out and to become cynical, especially in this professional group. And then self-awareness, of course, which very much ties into implicit bias. Community-oriented approaches are another that are quite popular, and this really does actually get at the underlying implicit bias issues, because if an officer is consistently interacting with members of a particular group in ways that are negative, it is going to be impossible for them not to develop implicit associations that are negative about that group. So having positive interaction, so kind of, making the effort to have these very positive interactions between the police and the community members is a very, very valid way of approaching this. So lastly, counter bias training simulation, which Steve has already mentioned. CBT Sim is our WSU training method. And it kind of combines a variety, combines all of these really. It's simulation based. It has a strong, of course, implicit bias component. It does, however, teach officers to focus on objective threat. It's a self-discovery of bias, and I'll get to some of the questions here in a moment that we ask that really try and uncover and elicit what that means. And then lastly, it's peer-based learning, which is really important that officers can kind of go through this together and learn from each other.
And it's grounded in adult learning theory, as opposed to the more didactic lecture that is potentially better suited to young children, but it's not the way adults learn.
So the types of questions that we ask after an officer kind of interacts with one of our scenarios, things like, what was the first thing that you noticed? What were you cueing off? Did anything concern you about this scenario? What were your impressions of the person? At what point did you recognize that it was going well or not well? Can you walk me through your decision-making process? And in hindsight, would you have done anything differently? So the responding officer kind of goes through these, and then it's opened up to their peer group. And I'll tell you, numerous times we've had officers who really did uncover some pretty important information about themselves. We hear things like, I didn't realize that was something that I didn't like, or I didn't realize that I interacted with this particular type of group in that particular type of way.
It's always interesting to me how unaware officers are of their own behaviors in these encounters, even in simulation. In a kind of a different project, slightly off topic, there was an officer I was working with, and every time they told the individual to put their hands up, they put their own hands up. And when I asked, why are you doing that? They were like, I don't do that. And I'm videoing them. So I rewind, press play. They were blown away that every time they said that, they had no awareness of their own words or actions. So I think we're gonna leave it there and move on to the discussion phase.
Yes, and I see we have.
My screen. We have one question that came in early, so we will address that one first.
Yes. So the question is, how will recent tragedies involving law enforcement affect law enforcement officers in responding to calls for help and or responding to contentious situations for fear of being accused of misconduct? That's a really, really excellent question. And I think the part of our talk that touched on this kind of fear of consequences is very relevant here to this question. And I mean, I certainly empathize. I know that policing is a very difficult and stressful occupation. I know that it is not a fun time to be a police officer. And I know that there are, kind of significant recruiting issues, significant retention issues. And yes, I mean, this is a very, very valid concern. I think the thing that's just really, really important is for departments, from the chief all the way down, have got to be on board with change that's coming, with change that's happening. And that just kind of has to, I hate to say, people need to get on board or leave, but unfortunately, I think we're kind of at that point where reform is absolutely inevitable. So, I mean, adjustments just have to be made.
I was in a meeting with some command staff from a large metropolitan police department, and I won't say who they are I think you'll realize why I'm not going to say who they are for obvious reasons, but in the first quarter of this year, they had 4 times more homicides than their average annual rate. And without a deep dive into the data, it's really difficult to understand why that is. But homicide rates, most major crime rates are relatively static year on year. and to see a jump of what could, at least a quadrupling, if not more, because this is the first quarter of the year was 4 times higher than their normal average fatality rate for homicides. It raises questions. Is there depolicing happening? Is there work to rule happening? Are people not responding? Is that just less presence, right? Within criminal justice theory, one of the cornerstones of criminal justice theory is a theory called routine activity theory. And routine activity theory requires the presence of 3 elements for a crime to take place: a suitable victim, a motivated offender, and the absence of guardians. Are our guardians absent, and is that why we are potentially seeing spikes in crimes that normally would take, so.
Yeah.
The recent passed laws by, so I'm going to read another question that just came into the Q&A. The recently passed laws by the Washington legislators, does it give some hope? How can we ensure that they are implemented meaningfully?
Yeah, I mean, I believe so, especially around some of the pursuit changes. I think that sometimes there can be some resistance to changing things that have always been, because we sometimes just feel comfortable with tradition. We feel comfortable with the way that things are. But like I said, I think that these changes are coming, and I know, I'm sure that there are lots of officers that are maybe not super happy about some of these changes, and in particular this very recently passed law, but I do think it is more in line with constitutional justice.
And to give us hope, I mean, Spokane City, Spokane County, most of their policies are already in line with the current laws or the new laws.
Yeah.
And I've always been an advocate to agencies to self-regulate before the legislature gets involved. This just gives teeth to the policies, which is great, right? Anytime we can, there's a couple of things that are required for policies to be effective. One is supervision, 2 is consequences, and 3 is training, right? So this is the consequence side of that I think certainly will assist. And the pursuit thing is interesting. The other area I work in, it was actually the topic of my PhD dissertation, is law enforcement collisions. And the fatality rate of innocent bystanders compared to offenders crashing and dying and officers being injured in pursuits is like astronomical. It's like 25 to 1 that innocent people are caught up in police pursuits. And over the last 15, 20 years, thousands of innocent bystanders have been killed in police pursuits. I don't have the exact, I wasn't prepared for that talk, but I do have those numbers because I'll be talking about it to the International Association of Chiefs of Police in Florida in August, about reducing. So the conference is on impaired driving, and the conference organizers were thinking about how can we better enforce impaired driving. Myself and the National Police Foundation are going to talk about the officer's own impaired driving, whether it be through fatigue or distraction.
I have a question. I wasn't able to type into the Q&A, but I see there's more people, so some people can. But my question was, your statement about police are designed to preserve the status quo just was like, oh, of course. And so that makes me feel like maybe the onus is on the community to help the police be the guardians that we want them to be.
And it's interesting because there's nothing new in policing. When we go back far enough, it's all been said and written before. And we go through these cycles and this pendulum swing of full enforcement versus community policing. And then sort of 9/11 happens and we're back to full enforcement and counterterrorism. And then there's a swing back to community-based policing or procedural justice. And I'm always reminded to go back to the tenets of Sir Robert Peel, the father of modern policing in London, and his 10 tenets of policing. If we stuck with those, most of the problems we're seeing would go away. And one of the key ones is that, the people are the police and the police are the people. And, I was talking to someone in my lab today that we need to always remain conscious that we give people, the police, the power. We, the people, give the police through legislatures and city officials and writing of laws. But, you know, I'm always probably the naysayer or the doomsayer, because I've worked, you know, I worked in Belfast for many, many years during the Troubles. And I've seen how bad it can get. And it might sound like I'm, you know, should be fitted for my tin hat, but when there's zero trust between police and communities, the level of violence, you know, I looked under my car every day before I got in it, looking for an IED, a bomb strapped to the bottom of my car, every day for years. Our police stations have RPG nets around them because the, you know, and police cars are armored. So that's how bad it can get. And the only thing that's going to fix this is the rebuilding of trust before anything else. And for the, not just for the community to trust the police, but for the police to trust their community and to trust that we are all working and trying to work for a safer, more inclusive society, and to bring more people into what is now considered the in-group, right? And part of that is around making sure that police look like our communities and they are representative in all aspects: race, sexual orientation, you know, whatever the demographic that is dividing us. Our police need to be reflective because they are the people, or they should be.
So question, the report about police citizen encounters didn't show any racial disparity. Was that study true representation of our community? Great question. Unfortunately, it's not. So there's a couple of reasons that I say that. One is if this is the ride-along study that's being asked about, one of the main things with the ride-along study is that we were riding with a subsample of officers who also did happen to be, you know, they were all CIT trained. They'd all, you know, well trained, well experienced. So I don't know if you can kind of, you certainly can't generalize from them to the department as a whole. In addition, although ride-along data, you know, ride-along studies are fantastic and you can certainly gain some great insight, you cannot ignore the possibility that officers are changing their behavior because they've got a researcher in the car with them, observing them, right? So no, I mean, I certainly don't think that because we didn't see it, it means it doesn't exist. And there have unfortunately also been studies within this particular department, within our community, that have shown something different. So I think it's important to always discuss, you know, lots of different, that's why I tried to kind of do a subsample of lots of different studies showing, you know, different sides of the story.
I had a question that was submitted earlier prior to the event. Is there a link, and you might have talked about this a little bit, I'm trying to recall, is there a link between officer mental health and use of force?
Ooh,
so not statistically, we haven't, you know, there's some privilege data there, you know, HIPAA laws and personnel files and so on. In our lab, we have found that more PTSD symptomology, not necessarily diagnosed PTSD, but self-diagnosed, self-reported symptoms of PTSD, if that makes sense, because you need some clinical provider to look not just at the tools, but also more in-depth clinical review. But when officers self-report the symptoms of PTSD, we see not only changes in how their brain oxygen is utilized in response to violent encounters in our simulator, we see a behavior change in that they're less willing to de-escalate.
Yeah, and more likely to use force.
That is, and it was my grad student who did that study for her PhD. It's, you know, so as part of a PhD dissertation, the literary review around the topic is quite extensive. There wasn't much there. There was no, so from a supervisor point of view, it's fabulous that my student is really breaking new ground in this topic area, to the point where she was immediately snapped up and gone to Navy as a postdoc, to work with a special forces group there and their mental health and ability to apply force. It's sad from a researcher and a community member's point of view that we just don't know. Now, I'm kind of near and dear to the topic of, does military service impact, prior military service impact use of force? And I can argue both sides of the case, that having prior, especially prior combat experience, could actually make you less likely to use force than more likely, because when you've seen combat overseas, you know what real danger looks like. So threat perception failure of being overwhelmed by a potentially dangerous encounter is less overwhelming when you've already faced the real thing, if that makes sense. Could be. At the same time, taking life once is argued that it also loosens that threshold for individuals.
And there's the PTSD component.
And the PTSD, well, yeah, that not everyone who's being combat has PTSD. So, these are really, really complex questions that, Lois and I have spent the last 12, 13 years looking at, along with a host of other researchers across the country. And sometimes it's demoralizing because we don't feel like, we certainly haven't answered the questions yet, and we do believe we're making progress. It's just slow and painstaking. But anything that we report from our lab, we will stand on. We will stand by. So, did that answer your question, Eric?
Yeah. It sounds like there needs to be some more research on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's always our answer. More research.
Yeah.
Keeps us in a job.
and there needs to be more resources. When we're talking about bias training, when we're talking about so on, the other big area, as we spoke last time, is around the health and wellness of the officers themselves. And we believe that that is one of the best ways to get good policing, right? To have non-fatigued, unstressed police officers. They are more likely to make the type of decisions and be the type of officers that our communities want, right? When their cognitive function is compromised due to stress, due to fatigue, due to behavioral health issues, due to previous traumas, the probability of having these tragedies occur again and again becomes higher. So it's a really interesting, discussion to have, that it may seem counter, like, why give them more when they're not doing the job we want? Well, if we give them more and they are, we treat them with the idea that they have human frailties too, then maybe they might be more forgiving of our own human frailties.
Well, I'm watching the clock on behalf of our speakers, so I'm going to close it down. But because we were a little shorter than is typical for our forums, I would encourage the audience, if you have questions that you have not been able to submit yet, please send them via the PEG website, and we will direct them to Doctors Lois and Steve.
Absolutely.
And
Very nice.
We'll get answers.
And we are very much looking forward to June, right?
Yes.
Continuation of this discussion, which would be wonderful.
Yes. So on behalf of the PEG board and the membership, we wish to extend our gratitude to both Lois and Steve for your willingness to spend the evening with us discussing this vital topic. Thank you also to the audience who are so much a part of the work that we do with PEG. A video of this evening's forum will be posted on our website within a week or so. And we hope, just as Lois just mentioned, we really hope you'll join us for part 2 of this series on June the 9th at 7 p.m. It's also a Zoom presentation. Our panel will include Spokane City Councilperson Betsy Wilkerson, Spokane NAACP First Vice President Curtis Robertson, former U.S. Attorney for Eastern Washington Bill Hislop, and Spokane City Police Chief Craig Meidel. We'll send out a Zoom link for the June forum very soon, and it will also be posted on Facebook and on our website. So thank you all again.
Thanks again for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Take care. Good night.
Bye.
You too. Good night, and thank you all.